It was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my two best friends. We were eager to escape the city and its constant rush, looking for a quiet place to relax and unwind. That's when we found this old hotel online, hidden deep in the mountains. It looked perfect in the photos, rustic, peaceful, with a touch of vintage charm. The price was too good to be true, but we didn't think twice. A few days of silence and nature, we couldn't resist. The drive up was long, winding roads, snaking through dense forests. By the time we reached the hotel, it was nearly dusk, and the light was fading fast. The hotel stood tall against the backdrop of the mountain, its faded paint and cracked windows suggesting it had seen better days. We were the only ones there. No cars in the lot, no guests in the lobby. Inside, the atmosphere was even more unsettling. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the dim lights flickered overhead. The receptionist, an old man with sunken eyes, barely acknowledged us. He handed us the keys to our room, muttering something we couldn't quite catch. I glanced at my friends, exchanging a nervous laugh. Maybe it was just old-world charm. After all, we were here for an adventure, right? We made our way up the creaky staircase to our room on the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched out in front of us, unnaturally long. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow us as we passed by. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet. Our room wasn't much better. The furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and the wallpaper was peeling off in patches. But we were determined to make the best of it. We unpacked quickly and decided to explore the hotel. That's when things started to feel off. As we walked through the hallways, it became apparent that something was wrong with this place. It felt too big, like the halls went on forever. We passed closed doors, each with a number on it, but no sounds of life behind them. At one point, I swore we'd already passed a particular room, even though we hadn't turned around. My friends laughed it off, blaming it on the layout of the old building. But I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. Later that night, we settled in for bed. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet. No wind outside, no creaks from the building, just dead silence. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something wasn't right. It wasn't until I heard the faintest of noises, like a whispering breeze, that I sat up. The noise was coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the windows. But then, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I nudged my friends awake, whispering for them to listen. We all sat there in the dark, straining to hear. And then we heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, but a low murmur, almost like someone was right outside our door. We froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the voice got louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was talking, just outside. One of my friends, trying to be brave, got out of bed and crept toward the door. She slowly opened it, and we all peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The voice stopped, but the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. Something was terribly wrong. We decided to stay awake the rest of the night, sitting huddled together on the bed, waiting for morning. But the longer we stayed there, the stranger things got. The air seemed to grow colder, and the walls felt like they were closing in on us. At one point, I swear I saw the reflection of someone standing in the mirror, but when I turned, no one was there. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore. We heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. They stopped right outside our door. We held our breath, too terrified to move. The doorknob turned slowly, creaking as if someone was about to enter. But the door never opened. Instead, a loud knock echoed through the room, shaking the walls. We didn't dare open the door again. We sat there, waiting, the seconds stretching into eternity. Finally, when the sun began to rise, the sounds stopped. We wasted no time. We grabbed our things and bolted out of that room, down the endless hallway, and out of the hotel. We didn't even stop to check out. As we drove away, none of us spoke. We couldn't explain what happened, but as we sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hotel stood in the distance, looming like a dark shadow, and for a brief moment, I saw someone standing in one of the windows watching us leave. It was the time of cold winter season in Portland. Me and my family decided to explore Chicago this weekend. On Sunday, we packed our things and started the trip. It was just supposed to be a quick stop on our road trip. My family and I had been driving for hours, and when we saw the old hotel by the side of the road, it seemed like a perfect place to stretch our legs. It looked abandoned at first, but when we pulled up, we saw a light in one of the windows. A sign hanging from the door said, "Vacancy." My parents and I entered the lobby, which had a strange, timeless quality to it. The walls were lined with dusty paintings, and the furniture looked as if it hadn't been used in years. An old man sat behind the front desk, his eyes blank and distant, as he handed us a key. "We'll take just one room," my dad said, already looking tired. "We're leaving first thing in the morning." The old man didn't say anything, just nodded and slid the key across the counter. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took the key from him. Something about this place didn't feel right, but we were all too tired to care. The room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The floor creaked beneath our feet as we walked, and the air smelled damp and old. When we reached our room, I was surprised by how spacious it was. It had 2 large beds, a small couch, and a window that looked out onto the dark forest beyond. But the odd thing was, the room didn't feel empty. It felt like someone had just left, like we were intruding. My mom shrugged it off, saying we were just tired, and my dad, eager to get some sleep, pulled back the sheets on one of the beds and collapsed. I sat on the couch, flipping through the channels on the old TV. The reception was terrible, just static and strange, crackling noises. I turned it off after a few minutes. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a door at the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows. It wasn't the bathroom door. That was on the other side. I hadn't noticed it before, and neither had my parents. Curious, I walked over to it and turned the knob. Locked. "Hey, Dad," I called. "What's this door for?" He barely looked up, already half asleep. "Probably a closet," he muttered. But it didn't feel like a closet door. It felt heavier, like something was behind it. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. But then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like something moving on the other side. I backed away quickly, my heart racing. My mom noticed and asked what was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain it. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and went to bed. That night, I woke up to a sound. A soft creaking, like wood bending under weight. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The noise was coming from the hidden door. Slowly, it grew louder. Something was moving behind that door. I held my breath, too scared to move. Then, the door began to shake, as if someone, or something, was trying to get out. The handle rattled, the wood groaned, and I could hear a low, guttural whisper coming from the other side. I jumped out of bed, waking my parents in the process. They looked confused and groggy as I pointed to the door, But when they looked at it, everything was still. The noises had stopped. My mom, clearly annoyed, told me it was just the old building settling. But I knew what I had heard. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, but I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at that door, waiting for it to move again. When morning finally came, I convinced my parents to leave as quickly as possible. We packed up and headed downstairs, eager to put the strange night behind us. As we checked out, I couldn't help but ask the old man at the desk about the door in our room. He stared at me for a long moment before answering. "There are no doors like that in the rooms," he said, his voice low and cold. "At least, none that lead anywhere." I felt a chill run down my spine as we left the hotel. To this day, I wonder what was behind that door, and I pray I never find out.
The hotel dining room was strangely empty for dinner time. I had checked in earlier that evening, a little road-weary and eager to find a place to eat. The hotel, though old and worn, had a quaint charm that drew me in. The receptionist had been polite, though distant, and the moment I entered my room, I felt a cold draft that I couldn't quite shake. I sat at the only occupied table in the dining hall, a small candle flickering dimly in front of me. The waiter was nowhere to be seen, and I wondered if I had made a mistake staying here. After several long minutes, he finally appeared, a tall, thin man in an outdated suit, his face pale and gaunt. His movements were slow, deliberate, and something about him felt wrong. He placed the menu in front of me without a word, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I glanced at it, and that's when I noticed the strange items listed. Dishes I had never heard of, with ingredients that made my stomach churn. Braised tongue in blackened sauce and roasted marrow on bone were just a few of the unsettling choices. "What do you recommend?" I asked, trying to break the eerie silence. The waiter tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question far too long. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said,
"The special. Always the special."
I hesitated but nodded. "Okay, I'll have the special." He smiled, an unnatural, crooked smile that sent a shiver down my spine, and disappeared into the kitchen. I waited, my eyes darting around the empty room, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. There was something terribly wrong with this place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After what felt like an eternity, the waiter returned, carrying a covered dish. He placed it in front of me with a small bow and removed the lid. The smell hit me first, rich, metallic, and sickeningly sweet. The dish was a grotesque pile of meat, glistening under the dim light. My stomach turned, and I pushed the plate away, trying not to gag. I think I'll just pass on dinner," I said, standing up quickly. The waiter didn't move, his eyes locked on mine, that strange smile still on his face.
"You've already ordered. You must eat."
Panic surged through me as I backed away from the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The waiter stepped closer, his movements slow, methodical. I could hear a faint hum coming from him, like a low, eerie tune. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't want to know, but something inside me needed to. Slowly, I turned back to face him.
"The special is always the same. It's what's left behind by those who never leave."
That's when I noticed the dining room walls, the faint stains, the lingering smell. This wasn't just an old hotel. This was a place where people disappeared, and I was next. Without another word, I bolted out of the dining room, running through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the waiter's eerie hum still ringing in my ears. I never looked back.
I was traveling alone, exploring the quiet countryside when I stumbled upon a small, unassuming hotel. Nestled between dense trees and the sound of rustling leaves, It looked like the perfect place to spend a night and recharge. The sign outside read, "The Hollow Inn," and despite its name, it felt cozy, even inviting. The receptionist, a kindly old woman with a soft smile, welcomed me in. She spoke with a gentle voice, offering a warm meal and a place to rest after my long journey. After signing the guest book, an ancient worn ledger filled with names, I made my way to my room. It was simple, a bed, a small chair, and an old wardrobe, but I felt comfortable there, like I had been here before, even though I hadn't. That evening, as promised, I made my way down to the dining area. The room was empty save for one table, set neatly with a single plate. The old woman entered, carrying a steaming bowl of stew. The smell was intoxicating, rich, hearty, with spices I couldn't quite place. I was starving from the journey, and I eagerly sat down to eat. The first spoonful was incredible. It was unlike anything I had tasted before, the flavors deep and complex. Each bite seemed to pull me in more, as if the food itself was calling to me. I couldn't stop eating. The world around me faded as I devoured the stew, unaware of anything else. When I finished, the old woman reappeared, her smile still as soft as ever.
"Did you enjoy it?"
she asked. I nodded, wiping my mouth. It was amazing. What was it? Her smile widened, but there was something darker behind it now.
"Family. Our family's special recipe, passed down for generations."
I froze, the words sinking in like a cold dagger to my chest. Something about the way she said it, the gleam in her eyes, set off alarms in my head. "What do you mean, family?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, just turned and walked back into the kitchen. I stood up, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned to leave, I noticed the photographs lining the walls. Each family was different, but the old woman was always there, standing in the background, unchanged, unaged. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what had happened to the families that came before me. The stew, the warmth, the invitation to stay. It was all part of the trap. They weren't just offering hospitality, they were feeding off their guests. Literally. I ran out of the dining room, my heart pounding. As I reached the door, I heard the old woman's voice behind me, calm and cold.
"We're always looking for new family members."
I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed place, the taste of the stew still lingering on my tongue. I never told anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But every now and then I catch the faint scent of that stew, and I wonder how many others have fallen into the trap. It was late, and I had been driving for hours through an unfamiliar town when I spotted the hotel. A neon sign flickered in the darkness, its letters spelling out, "The Morgan Hotel." Exhausted and desperate for sleep, I pulled into the parking lot. The building looked old, a relic from another time, but I didn't care. All I needed was a bed. Inside, the lobby was empty. The dim lights cast long shadows on the walls, and the only sound was the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. After a few minutes, a man appeared from a back room. He was tall, with a lean build and dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Just need a room for the night," I said, already feeling the weight of exhaustion pull at me. The man smiled, a strange, crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said,
"Of course. Here is the key of room 13. It's quiet."
The way he said quiet made my skin crawl, but I was too tired to think much of it. I thanked him and made my way up the stairs to the second floor. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit, the old carpet worn and faded. Room 13 was at the very end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed and a nightstand. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But at that moment, All I cared about was sleep. I dropped my bag on the floor, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. I must have drifted off almost immediately, but my sleep was restless. I kept waking up, feeling like something was wrong, but unable to pinpoint what. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I listened closely, there was only silence. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. I listened carefully, straining to hear if the noise would come again. And then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from just outside my door. I froze, fear gripping my chest. Slowly, I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My only option was to stay quiet and hope whatever it was would go away. The scraping continued, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if something or someone was moving closer to my room. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Suddenly the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment I thought maybe it was over. But then the doorknob turned. I leapt out of bed, my mind racing. I had no weapon, nowhere to hide. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the door slowly creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and shadowy, holding something in its hand, a knife. The man from the front desk stepped into the room, his eyes cold and lifeless. The smile was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. He raised the knife, his movements deliberate, as if he had done this many times before. I backed into the corner, my hands trembling. Why are you doing this?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just stepped closer, the blade gleaming in the dim light. My mind screamed at me to move, to fight, but I was frozen in place, terror locking my limbs. Just as he lunged, something in me snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from the nightstand, and swung it with all my strength. The impact knocked him off balance, and I bolted for the door, not daring to look back. I ran through the hallways, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the tires screeching as I peeled out of the parking lot. I never went back for my things. I never reported the man to the police. Some places, some people, are better left forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple vacation. My family and I had planned a weekend away, staying in a historic hotel that had been recommended to us by a friend. The place was known for its charm, its old-world feel, and the fact that it had been around for over 100 years. But when we arrived, something about the hotel seemed off. The exterior looked exactly as we expected, aged but grand. Inside, the lobby was beautifully restored, with antique furniture and rich wood paneling. But it was the receptionist who first unsettled me. She was polite, but there was something strange about her demeanor, something distant, almost mechanical. She gave us the key to our room, room 213, and without another word, turned back to her paperwork. Our room was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. The hotel was surprisingly quiet for such an old building, and I noticed there were very few other guests. It was odd, but we didn't think much of it at the time. The room itself was comfortable enough, with 2 large beds and a window overlooking the garden. We spent the day exploring the nearby town, returning to the hotel in the evening. But when we went to our room, something strange happened. We reached the end of the hallway where room 213 should have been, but the door was gone. Instead, there was just a blank wall where the door had once been. Confused, we retraced our steps, thinking we had taken a wrong turn, but no matter how many times we walked down the hallway, our room had vanished. Panicking, we returned to the front desk, where the receptionist stared at us blankly. She said,
"I'm sorry, but we don't have a room with number 213.
I insisted, explaining that we had stayed in that very room just hours ago. But she only shook her head. She said,
"There must be some mistake. Maybe you're thinking of another hotel."
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My family was just as confused and anxious as I was. We demanded to see a manager, but she simply stared at us, her face blank, her eyes distant. We left the front desk, determined to find our room or at least our belongings. But no matter how many times we searched the hotel, room 213 was gone. It was as if it had never existed. The more we searched, the stranger things became. By the time night fell, we realized we were trapped. The hotel was no longer the charming place we had entered. It had become a maze, a labyrinth that twisted and turned, leading us in circles. The walls seemed to close in on us, and every door we opened led to another identical hallway. We eventually gave up, finding a small lounge area to rest in. As we sat in the eerie silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced at my parents, their faces pale and tired, and knew we had to get out. The receptionist and the guests were gone. We left the hotel in no time. Next day, we reported it to police. They raided it, but didn't find anything wrong. The receptionist was changed, and there were many guests in hotel. What we experienced last night was terrible and mysterious for us till now. I had been driving for hours when I finally saw the sign, Motel 77. It wasn't much to look at. A rundown, one-story building with peeling paint and flickering neon lights. But it was late, and I was tired. All I wanted was a bed to sleep in for the night. The man at the front desk barely looked up as I checked in, handing me the key to room 5 without a word. The room itself was dingy, with faded curtains and a musty smell, but I didn't care. I dropped my bag on the bed, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a loud thud. It sounded like it came from the room next door, room 6. I lay there for a moment, listening, but the noise didn't come again. Figuring it was just someone moving around, I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I was drifting off, I heard another noise. This time, it was a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The noise was coming from room 6, just on the other side of the thin wall. Curious, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. I opened it, just a crack, peering out into the dark, empty parking lot. Room 6's door was closed, but the scraping sound continued from inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something told me I shouldn't get involved, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out into the hallway and knocked on the door of room 6. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. I called out, "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" Still no response, but the scraping sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I stood there, debating whether to try the door. Suddenly, the door to room 6 swung open, and a man stood there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Is everything okay?" I asked again, my voice trembling. The man stared at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and empty. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the room and slammed the door shut in my face. I stood there, stunned. Something was seriously wrong with that man. I rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Should I call someone? Report it to the front desk? But before I could do anything, I heard the scraping sound again. This time it was coming from the wall behind me. Room 6. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. The sound was clearer now, like something being dragged across the floor. Or someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the room, not stopping until I was in my car. Speeding away from that place, I don't know what was happening in room 6, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never stop at a roadside motel again.
The weekend getaway was meant to be a reprieve from the chaos of city life. The historic hotel, with its grandiose facade and aged charm, seemed like the perfect escape. My excitement was palpable as I drove up the winding mountain road, the anticipation of a serene retreat growing with every turn. However, as I approached the hotel, the excitement was tinged with an unsettling sensation. The building, while impressive, had a decayed elegance. Its once pristine paint was now faded and peeling, and the windows, though clean, revealed the scars of time. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally across the old structure. Entering the lobby, I was struck by its opulence, yet it felt strangely lifeless. The grand chandelier, once sparkling with light, now cast dim reflections across the room. Dust motes danced in the weak light, and the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and stale air. The walls were lined with portraits of long-gone hotel owners, their eyes seeming to follow me with an unsettling intensity. The furniture was antique, its grandeur diminished by the passage of time. The overall feeling was one of being in a place frozen in history, where time had slowed to a crawl. The bellhop who greeted me was a relic of the past himself. His uniform was old-fashioned, with brass buttons that gleamed in the dim light. His face, though polite, carried a distant look. He offered a courteous nod and a brief, almost mechanical smile as he took my suitcase. His movements were smooth, but unnaturally deliberate, like a character in an old film. He led me to my room, a spacious suite that exuded an old-world charm. The high ceilings were adorned with intricate moldings, and the antique furniture, though elegant, seemed slightly out of place. The bed was draped with a heavy velvet coverlet, and the air was noticeably colder than I had anticipated. The bellhop left me with a small, ornate brass bell on the nightstand. "If you need anything, just ring the bell," he said, his voice echoing slightly as he retreated down the hallway. As night settled in, the room took on an even more eerie atmosphere. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, and the stillness was profound, as though the entire hotel was holding its breath. I tried to dismiss the creeping unease as a result of the long drive and unfamiliar surroundings. I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy covers up to my chin, but sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of my eye. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint knock on the door. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. The knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and opened the door, only to find the hallway empty. The silence that greeted me was oppressive, filled with the echoes of my own footsteps and the distant, disconcerting hum of the hotel's ancient heating system. I closed the door and locked it, my mind racing with explanations. I chalked it up to the wind, or perhaps an overactive imagination. I returned to bed, but the knocking continued, now accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. My pulse quickened, and I found myself straining to listen. In the darkened room, the sounds grew more distinct. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate, and the knocking became rhythmic, as though someone, or something, was trying to get in. My mind raced through scenarios, none of them comforting. I gripped the brass bell on the nightstand, its cool surface a stark contrast to the warm sweat on my palms. The scraping noise seemed to come from behind the door, intensifying, as if whatever was making the sound was growing more desperate. I could almost feel the vibrations through the floor. The knocking became a pounding, relentless and insistent. I held my breath, my body frozen in fear. The noises continued unabated, a cacophony of sound that seemed to engulf the room. Desperate to understand what was happening, I crept closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. The scraping noise was unmistakable now, like nails or claws against wood. The knocking was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper, a voice that seemed to murmur unintelligible words. My mind raced, conjuring images of what might be on the other side. Was someone trapped? Was there a hidden danger waiting to break through? The sounds continued through the night, growing louder and more frenzied. My exhaustion mingled with fear, and I finally succumbed to a restless sleep. When I awoke, it was dawn, and the room was bathed in a pale, ghostly light. The hotel was eerily quiet, as if the night's disturbances had been nothing but a bad dream. I checked out of the hotel later that morning, my nerves frayed and my mind troubled. As I approached the front desk, the bellhop from the night before was there, his presence as unnerving as ever. I hesitated, but then asked about the door in my room. The old man behind the desk seemed to pause for an eternity, his gaze distant and inscrutable. The bellhop's face remained obscured in the dim light of the lobby, but I could feel his attention focused on me. His response, though elusive, was filled with an unsettling gravity. He offered no direct answers, only a cryptic, unspoken acknowledgement of the strangeness that had occurred. I left the hotel and drove away. This experience sent a shiver down my spine. I am unable to shake the feeling that I had just left something behind, a presence that lingered in the old hotel's dark corners.
The weekend getaway was supposed to be my escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I'd been craving a break from the constant noise and stress, so when I stumbled upon an old hotel on the edge of town, it seemed like the perfect solution. The hotel's website was full of charming descriptions and vintage photographs that promised a serene retreat. I was sold. When I arrived at the hotel, I was struck by its old-world charm. The building itself looked like something out of a bygone era, with ivy crawling up the brickwork and large wooden double doors that creaked when I pushed them open. Inside, the lobby was decorated with antique furniture, and the walls were lined with framed black-and-white photos of the hotel's history. It felt like stepping back in time. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, greeted me as I entered. She seemed to radiate a calm, almost otherworldly serenity. After a few minutes of small talk and paperwork, she handed me a brass key labeled Room 196. Her smile remained fixed as she wished me a pleasant stay, though there was something in her eyes that made me pause. It was almost as if she knew something I didn't. I thanked her and took the elevator up to the second floor. The elevator was ancient, with a clunky metal door and a faint smell of oil and dust. It rattled and groaned as it ascended, and I felt a strange twinge of unease. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. The carpet was plush but worn, and the wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing the underlying plaster. I walked down the corridor, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The hallway was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling. As I approached room 196, I noticed that the other room numbers on this floor were quite different. ranging from 191 to 195. Room 196 seemed oddly out of place. When I reached the door to room 196, I found it to be an old, weathered affair. The brass number was crooked, barely clinging to the door. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a shiver of uncertainty, but I pushed it aside and unlocked the door. It swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. The room was dark, even with the door open. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out any natural light. A heavy layer of dust coated everything, making the air feel thick and stale. The furniture was old and covered with white sheets that hung limply, adding to the sense of abandonment. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The room remained shrouded in darkness. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. As I moved the light around, I saw that the room was furnished with a large, ornate bed, an old wooden dresser, and a few pieces of antique furniture covered in dust. The centerpiece was a grand mirror on the far wall, its surface reflecting nothing but shadow. The atmosphere in the room was unsettling. There was a strange chill in the air, and despite the fact that I was alone, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it and started to settle in, placing my bags down and unpacking a few items. But the sense of unease grew stronger. It was then that I first heard it. A faint, whispering sound. At first I thought it was just the creak of the old building, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I listened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, though I couldn't make out any words. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the whispers continued. The whispering seemed to come from all around, as though the room itself was trying to communicate something. I turned around, shining my flashlight into every corner, but there was no one there. The shadows in the room seemed to move and shift, playing tricks on my eyes. I felt a growing sense of dread and decided to check the door to see if it was still unlocked. As I reached for the handle, the door suddenly slammed shut behind me with a force that made the walls shake. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the handle and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. My breathing quickened, and I felt a rush of panic. The whispering grew louder, turning into an insistent murmur that filled the room. I could hear fragments of words, pleas for help, desperate cries that seemed to echo off the walls. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath coming out in frosty puffs. I tried to remain calm, but the feeling of claustrophobia was overwhelming. I turned back to the mirror, drawn to it by an inexplicable compulsion. The mirror's surface seemed to swirl with darkness, and as I watched, I saw a shadowy figure begin to take shape behind me. My heart raced as I spun around, but the room was still empty. The figure was only visible in the reflection, its form indistinct and shifting. The whispering turned into laughter, low and mocking. The sound seemed to come from all directions, filling the room with an unsettling, eerie quality. I could feel the presence behind me, the cold air brushing against my neck. The figure in the mirror seemed to be getting closer, its face twisted into a malevolent grin. I could almost feel its cold breath on my skin. Desperation took hold. I grabbed the mirror and hurled it to the ground with all my strength. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and in that instant, the door flew open. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air and feeling a rush of relief. I glanced back into the room, but it was empty now. The laughter was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't stop to look around. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I reached the elevator and pressed the button frantically. When the doors finally opened, I practically threw myself inside. As the elevator descended, I glanced back down the hall, half expecting to see something following me. But the hallway was empty, and the elevator doors closed. I went straight to the front desk and told the receptionist everything that had happened. Her calm demeanor never wavered as she listened. When I finished, she simply nodded and said, "I'm sorry you had that experience. We've had a few guests mention strange things in that room before. It's been there for a long time, and not many people stay there." I left the hotel without another word, leaving the key behind. I drove away. The memory of that night lingered in my mind. The figure in the mirror, the whispers, and the cold presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, even as I left the hotel far behind. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts were consumed by what I had experienced. I found myself glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Still, the sense of unease lingered. When I finally got home, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination, and that the hotel had probably just been old and poorly maintained. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the images of that night kept haunting me. The figure in the mirror, the cold breath, and the laughter, they were burned into my memory. To this day, I still wonder if that room was real, or if it was a place trapped between reality and something darker. I've never returned to that hotel, and I hope no one else ever has to experience what I did. The room that wasn't supposed to exist remains a haunting reminder of a weekend getaway gone terribly wrong. The sense of dread never fully faded. I still find myself shivering when I think about that night. I often wonder what other secrets the hotel might hold, and if there are more rooms like 196, places where reality bends and dark entities dwell, waiting for their next visitor. So if you ever find yourself near that old hotel on the edge of town, think twice before checking in. Some rooms are better left undisturbed, and some experiences are best left in the shadows where they belong. I had been searching for the perfect getaway, something quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. A quaint, charming hotel on the outskirts of town caught my eye during an online search. The photos were enchanting. Vintage furnishings, a cozy atmosphere, and a picturesque facade that seemed straight out of a classic film. I imagined sipping coffee on a sunlit porch, immersed in a book and the sounds of nature. So, I booked a room and eagerly awaited my retreat. Upon arriving, the hotel appeared just as lovely as the photos suggested. The building had a timeless elegance with ivy climbing up its brick walls and an intricate wrought iron gate leading to the entrance. The lobby was decorated with antique furniture, rich carpets, and soft lighting that created a warm, inviting ambiance. Yet there was something oddly still about the place, a quiet that felt almost too profound. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a stern face and sharp eyes, handed me the key to room 307. Her voice was a monotone that contrasted sharply with the hotel's otherwise charming atmosphere. As she gave me my key, she mentioned in a low voice that the third floor had recently been renovated. I thanked her and headed towards the elevator, trying to shake off the strange sensation that seemed to cling to me. The elevator was old and creaky, groaning under the weight of its own age as it carried me to the third floor. I stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked with every step I took. The corridor was long and narrow, with the occasional flicker of a dim light that cast eerie shadows on the walls. My room was located at the very end of the hall. I reached it and unlocked the door with a shaky hand. As it swung open, I was greeted by a room that was both charming and unsettling. The furnishings were old but well kept. A large four-poster bed, draped with a heavy quilt, a vintage armchair in the corner, and a wooden dresser with an ornate mirror above it. The view from the window looked out onto a small garden that seemed neglected, with overgrown bushes and tangled vines. I tried to push aside the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I unpacked my things, took a hot shower, and settled into bed, hoping that the comforting familiarity of routine would dispel the strange atmosphere. However, as night fell, an unsettling silence enveloped the room. It was too quiet, so quiet that the stillness seemed to press in on me from all sides. As I lay in bed, trying to drift off, I began to hear a faint whispering sound. At first it was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it. I turned over, adjusting my pillow, and tried to ignore it. But the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from within the walls themselves, a soft murmur that sounded like a woman's voice. My heart began to race as the whispers became clearer. It was as if someone was calling out for help, their voice laced with desperation. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. I could make out fragmented words. "Help me, please," each one more urgent than the last. The room was cold, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. I got out of bed and approached the wall, pressing my ear against it. The whispering stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the old building. I stepped back, confused and slightly shaken. Just as I turned to return to bed, there was a loud bang from the other side of the room. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I jumped, my heart pounding, and rushed to the door. To my horror, it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle and pushed against the door with all my strength, but it felt as if it was glued shut. Panic set in. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the whispering growing louder and more frantic. The whispers now seemed to be coming from every direction, a cacophony of pleas and cries. "Help me," the voice repeated, more desperate than before. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath forming in thick clouds. I tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths to steady myself. But the fear was overwhelming. I turned back to the walls, trying to find the source of the sound. The whispering was now accompanied by a soft, eerie wail that seemed to echo through the room. I could feel the air growing colder, and a cold draft swept across the room, making the curtains flutter. The feeling of being watched was intense, as if unseen eyes were following my every move. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a nearby chair and used it to try and force the door open. I battered at the door, but it remained stubbornly shut. My hands were shaking, and my breathing was ragged. The whispers continued, growing louder and more urgent. "Please help me. I'm here. Help." I felt a chill run down my spine. I could no longer ignore the sensation that something was terribly wrong. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I could see the shadows in the room shifting and moving, the darkness seeming to press in from all sides. The whispering became a frantic scream, filling my ears with its urgency, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. I grabbed a lamp from the bedside table and swung it at the door. The glass shattered, and the metal base made a loud clang against the door. The door groaned and shuddered, but remained closed. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. The whispering was now a deafening roar in my ears. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the direction of the window. I turned, expecting to see something, but the room was still empty. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. The room was eerily silent. I turned back to the door, and to my surprise, It was now slightly ajar. With a mix of relief and trepidation, I pushed the door open and stumbled into the hallway. The corridor was still dimly lit, the lights flickering as if in response to my presence. I glanced back at the room, but it was now just a normal, empty space. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the sense of dread lingered. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I reached the lobby and found the receptionist sitting behind the desk, her eyes fixed on a book. She looked up in surprise as I approached, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "I need to check out," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't stay here." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp.
"What happened?"
I recounted the events of the night, the whispering, the banging, the cold draft. She listened intently, her face expressionless. When I finished, she nodded slowly.
"You're not the first to hear her. She's been trapped in those walls for decades."
I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The receptionist's words only deepened my sense of dread. I quickly gathered my things, leaving the key behind. I rushed to my car, my heart still racing, and drove away from the hotel as fast as I could. As I left the hotel behind, the feeling of being watched remained. The whispers seemed to follow me, echoing in my mind. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear them, soft, pleading voices that drift through my dreams. The hotel was a place I hoped never to return to, and I still wonder what other secrets it might hold. In the days that followed, I did some research about the hotel, but I could find no information about the woman or her story. It was as if her presence was a ghost of the past, forgotten by everyone but me. The whispers and the cold draft were memories that I couldn't escape, reminders of a night that was both chilling and inexplicable. I have not returned to that hotel, and I hope I never have to. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The hotel's quiet, eerie atmosphere was more than just a setting. It was a living entity, holding on to something dark and tragic. The whispers may have faded from my ears, but they continue to haunt my dreams, a chilling reminder of a night I would rather forget. If you ever find yourself near that old hotel, take my advice. Stay away. Some places are better left to their own dark secrets, and some experiences are best left undisturbed, hidden within the walls where they belong. If you enjoyed these stories and want more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a terrifying update. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Thanks for watching.